Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to 2024 and welcome to the first episode of the podcast in 2024. So the end of the year and the beginning of another is always such an interesting time. And if my own life is any sort of indication, usually this is a threshold period that's marked by a lot of busy moments and usually pretty intense energy. So whenever it is that you're listening to this, I hope that you were able to get some rest and that you were able to care for yourself in all of the ways. At the start of the Gregorian calendar year here, I invited the astrologer Erin Tack Shipley to look at and to share her thoughts with us on the astrology of 2024. Erin has been on the podcast a couple times, and I've worked with Erin in different capacities. She's a friend, a mentor, a colleague, and an inspiration throughout my journey. So I'm super excited to share this conversation with you. The night before we recorded the conversation, Erin reached out and asked if we could discuss the astrology of the coming year in two parts. And I'm really glad that she did because turns out we had a lot to discuss. So this episode is part one, where we covered the first half of the year, and we will be releasing part two very soon, where we discuss the second half of the year. I hope that this is an episode and a conversation that is nourishing for you. I also encourage you to continue to return to this conversation over the course of the year as an anchor. In the show notes, I have included the timestamps of where we discuss different months. So feel free to use that to jump ahead to the month that you would like to review when and if that feels supportive to you. All right, here is the first half of the astrology of 2024 with E.T. Shipley. All right, here we are. Welcome to the podcast, Erin. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Jonathan. So good to be here. I'm excited.
I'm always so excited to talk to you, but today we're going to be talking about the astrology of 2024. And I was telling you right before we were recording that when I felt into who I would want to do it with this year, yours was the only name that came up. So I was like, okay, let's reach out and see if Erin's interested. So I'm very excited that you said yes. And yeah, there's really no one else I'd rather be doing this with than you at this moment.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's honestly an honor. And I was just saying to you, like, I'm a little nervous, but I'm glad it's with you because our discussions are just always so wildly rich and interesting and take me places that I didn't expect. And I'm taking Austin Coppock's Astrology Fundamentals just to like brush up on the basics. And we were in class last night talking about essential dignity and exalted planets. And somebody had written in the chat that exalted planets or like planets in exaltation are like planets at or like with a best friend that brings out the best in you and like tells you the truth about your faults, like de-emphasizes your faults, but highlights like the best parts of you. And I kind of feel that way when I'm talking to you, like you bring out the best in me as an astrologer and a person. So I'm really happy to be here.
I love hearing that, Erin. I feel the same way about you. I feel always so inspired by your depth of reflections and also just how inspired I feel when I'm around you. And I feel like we go to places and they're always very deep and very fun. And um, yeah, so let's do this.
Mhm. So
um,
how are you feeling about 2024?
I'm, it's interesting because I feel like 2023 has been such a massive year in so
Mm,
many levels that I think there's no way out of 2023 but just being excited that the year is over, you know?
mm,
So by that virtue, it kind of feels to me like 2024 is bringing some very new flavors or maybe um an augmentation variation that is different enough than what we've seen in the past few years, if that makes sense. Like it kind
mm,
of feels
mhm,
to me like and this may be personal, but I've been feeling that 2019 to 2023, the end of 2019 to 2023, so like the past 4 years was kind of this one chapter, and then we're entering into a new chapter, and it's taking a new direction. And um, yeah, how does that land for you?
mm. Yeah, I feel a little bit I feel a little bit like that. I've heard the opposite from other people where they feel like it's a wrapping up.
Mm,
Um, and I almost feel like it's limbo.
mm, mhm,
And I think a lot of that has to do with where so many of the outer planets are. Just like the invisible to the naked eye planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto.
mhm,
And we had like the tiniest taste, like a drop of Pluto in Aquarius last year. And we really start to get to know that this year, right from the beginning. But Uranus and Neptune are just they're not budging yet. And so the way that I'm looking at this year is that very much like a it's a transitional period. It's like it's not fully death, it's not fully birth, it's something
mm,
in between.
mhm,
And I feel like we're in this like collective hospice moment. Um, and I've talked about death in a number of podcasts, maybe on one of the episodes on this show, but there's this idea of like supporting the person who's dying versus supporting the community that's around the person because the person
mm,
is like busy dying. And
mhm,
I kind of feel like it's a little bit of both. Uh, and at the same time having to look at, well, what are we going to do next? And
mhm,
I think it's too much of a reach to say that it's the beginning
mm,
of something new,
mhm,
because there's just so much celestially that's unfinished in the
mm,
signs.
mhm.
But it's also like, I think it's also too much of a reach to say like, oh, it's the end.
Yeah.
Like it's not quite there yet either,
Mhm,
or it's
mhm,
only the end. Like we're yeah, it's limbo.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, it's making me think about how what's been striking me about the astrology of 2024 is that we are definitely continuing with some of the themes that began in 2023. So, for example, with Saturn in Pisces, with the nodes in Aries and Libra, this past year, 2023, things were kind of introduced, themes were
Hmm.
introduced, and I think 2024 is more of like a development leading into the finale, of those themes, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the onions and garlic have been in the pan for a moment, and you are now starting to smell the flavor that they're releasing from having
Hmm.
been cooked for a while.
Hmm.
Uh and it feels like, just looking at the timing of things, it it's like the first half of the year has this really interesting rhythm of like stelliums concentrated in one sign after another after another.
Hmm.
Um, and then the second half of the year, the tone is totally different.
Yeah.
And so it it's it's like a very windy mountain road.
Hmm.
It's like you're
Hmm.
along the coast for a while and you kind of have like a feel for how the turns are going. And then randomly you hit this tunnel and you don't know when you're going to get out. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel
Right. Right.
eventually.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Hmm. Um, Before we get further into like the breakdown of month by month what's going to happen in the first half of the year, um, I do want to say a couple things. One is that we decided we're going to do this in two episodes. So this
Mhm.
episode we're going to be talking about the first half, and then we're going to release a second episode on the second half. And the other thing I wanted to make sure to get to before we go further is to have some space where you get to introduce yourself to those
Hmm.
listening who maybe haven't heard of your work or haven't heard of you. You've been on the podcast a couple times, but yeah, maybe we have some new listeners. So, would you want to introduce yourself, Erin?
Thanks, Jonathan.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm Erin, also known as ET, uh, at ET Shipley on all the socials. Ship like a boat, Ley. And I'm a professional consulting astrologer. So I see clients one on one. I do a lot of work on attachment and astrology. So I work with a lot of folks who are interested in ameliorating or enhancing or learning more about how they are in relationship to people with whom they are intimate or want to be intimate. Um, and I don't mean intimacy in like a sexual way. I just mean like all of the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual aspects of intimacy. Um, I mean, in like a holistic way. I
Hmm.
also, this past summer, taught the first edition of a course called Templum 80s that Jonathan was in. Which is about the third house. And the third house is a place of presence and ritual and uh, in like physical environment and so much more.
Hmm.
And it's called the least good of the good, the least bad of the bad. And it really is like a place where we build the world that we move in all the time.
Mm.
And so a lot of this year as an astrologer is going to be affirming through the things that I'm creating what it means to be a ritual strategist and helping people strategize their ethos, their movements in the world, their work, their relationships in a way that's rooted in a deeper connection to spirit, astrologically and otherwise, and builds rituals that help them continue on that path that they're wanting to be on, or
Mm.
discovering it if they don't know
Hmm.
what it is.
Hmm.
Yeah,
I
that's
love that.
a
Yeah.
little bit.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. I'm curious to hear actually this connection between astrology and ritual for you. And especially in
Mm.
light of looking at the astrology of the year ahead, is there yeah, how do you view this act as supportive to all the ways that we create and crave ritual as humans?
Mhm. Mm. I think that so much of my world, like conceptually, is a dance between Jupiter and Saturn. And Jupiter deals with a lot of potentiality and opportunity and uh, like holistic growth. And Saturn is interested in reality and limits and like manifesting. And um, when I think about ritual, I'm thinking about like the enduring habits that can be made magical.
Mm.
Like the ease of bringing the magic into the everyday and thereby like holistically improving our lives in ways that enable us to better focus on the plot line or the through line that we're wanting to carry. Like if we were carrying a thread through a labyrinth, being able to hold on tight to that thread, like Ariadne and the Minotaur. Um, yeah, so ritual is interesting because it's adaptable.
Mm.
Like there's this idea that ritual, like we we ritualize or we repeat the same thing over and over again, and that can be true a lot of the time. Like it anchors us, but you can also change it or create something new or something specific to a moment. Like maybe somebody in your world is dying, or maybe you're wanting to cast like a spell for abundance. Um, a spell that has a series of actions that legitimately improve the possibility for you to bring in abundance, like actually doing money making things,
Mm-hmm.
will drastically improve the efficacy of the spell.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
when we ritualize things, especially if we're involving like repetition of actions, we are continuing to anchor ourselves to our goals
Mm-hmm.
in a way that is more physical than if we just think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I'm hearing is alignment and congruence through repetition. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And like not repetition without change either. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I've had a morning ritual practice for like 9 years or something like that. And it has gone through so many different evolutions.
Yeah.
Like now I light a candle every day. Before I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
There were just little things. Like sometimes I go through phases where I'm pulling a lot of tarot cards, and sometimes I'm just writing. Sometimes I'm just saying prayers. And um, yeah, there's so many different things that we can do to carry ourselves towards the things that we want to see in the world that we want to create and exist within.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel like over the years in, because I know you've been doing astrology for some time, do you notice that there has been a shift in how you see the threshold between one year ending and another year starting for you in kind of being with astrology? Hmm. Does that question make sense?
Kind of, but can you reword it and maybe I'll be able to
Yeah.
grasp it a little tighter.
Yeah, maybe I'll rephrase it using my own personal example, because I feel like for me what astrology has taught me is that it's made me more aware of the different relationships I have with time. So for
Mm-hmm.
example, there were times where, let me rephrase this. I am noticing that sitting here with you in this space, thinking about the first half of 2024, I'm wearing a very different set of glasses than what I do when I'm showing up for my weekly episodes, where I talk about the
Mm-hmm.
astrology of the week ahead. To me, it requires a different perspective. It requires a different energetic setting to look at a larger swath of time as opposed to just what's coming up next week, right? Or like
Mm-hmm.
what's coming up today in this particular full moon. And what's cool about astrology is that because it's a study of cycles, it enables us, or rather, maybe it necessitates us to put on these different lenses, right? And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we look short term, sometimes we look long term. And so I guess I'm just curious to hear more about your experience around what it's been like living alongside astrology for some time, and
Mm-hmm.
how over time you've noticed different chapters of how you relate to the threshold between one year ending and another starting. Is that a clearer phrasing?
I think so, a little bit.
Hmm.
One of the things that I was pulling cards the other day and trying to be really pragmatic and logical, and they were all like, no, you like really need to just sit with your intuition. Um, and I have my son in the third house. So I actually feel, I think, most centered when I'm moving intuitively.
Mm.
Um, and I can certainly strategize for a year ahead, and I tend to, but I think that is more about my personal chart than anything. I have a Capricorn ascendant. And so when the new year happens, the sun is moving through my first house, which always feels like a reset, on top of it being the reset of the return of the light.
Mhm.
Um, so from that perspective, I think there's actually a lot of similarity of the feeling of this type of this time of year,
Mm. Mhm.
um, from one year to another. If anything, I think each year it just gets it's like a time when astrology gets reaffirmed for me, because I started out as a skeptic
Mhm.
and still hold that sometimes, but like from a felt perspective, like a more embodied perspective, um, yeah, feeling into the year ahead is it's always a really like refreshing experience to zoom out,
Mhm.
because I spend a lot of time intuitively carrying the thread. Like I know what
Mm.
the thread is that I'm carrying, but
Mhm.
it feels like a lot of like chop wood, carry water.
Yeah.
And so this is like a moment where I've put the wood down, the bucket of water is also down, and I'm just like on the edge of the lake, and there's
Mm.
like stones on the beach,
Mhm.
and the water's like gently lapping on the shore, and
Mhm.
the sun is rising, and I'm just like looking out at the scenery and trying to take a moment and a breath and get a sense of what's coming up.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Um, it's making me think of something that I think is leading me to my next question for you before we actually go into like the breakdown of month by month, which is I'm curious to hear what intention you're bringing into this space here with me. And
Mm.
I'm gonna share with you what I'm bringing in as an intention that actually just kind of came as you were speaking just now, which is for me the act of looking at time is never a static thing. Like
Mm-hmm.
I remember vividly last year doing the 2023 astrology with Diana Rose Harper, our colleague and friend, and how cute it was for me to look back at that time and realize that I had certain ideas or conceptions about how the year was going to end based on the experience of having done it. And then now being at the end of the year, actually I'm having a very, very different experience. And so um, I think for me, my intention is really to like here at the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, I am opening up a door towards a curious exploration of what the year might be bringing in.
Mm-hmm.
More so than maybe even um, like a predictive lens, but that's not to say that I am not available for oracular interruptions, because I always love those. So yeah, I think I'm bringing in curiosity. That's kind of how I'm approaching this time together. But I'm curious to hear what's currently alive for you.
Yeah, so good to hear what you're bringing in based on what you've learned too from having done this.
Mm.
Forecasting is always funny for me because I don't love predictive astrology. And if I'm doing it for myself, it's not good because I can get a little, what was the word that my friend used? Um, just like catastrophic thinking. It's like, It's like not super healthy. Like they say astrologers shouldn't read their own charts.
Mm.
Uh, and obviously we can't help it. But I like to think of forecasting as practice
Mm-hmm.
because it is a really good way to learn about and understand and rethink things like mundane astrology, things that we already know.
Mm-hmm.
And I love throwing out metaphors for how something might feel because we don't then need to know what's going to happen. We just get to play, like exist in the field of play.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I was a like budding astrologer, I used to listen to like weekly forecasts or monthly forecasts or yearly forecasts. And they were some of the most educational content that I was able to access because I was
Mm-hmm.
just listening to astrologers talk to one another about what um like how a planet might act in a certain place or in relationship to another planet. And so I think if I'm bringing any intentions, it is to play, practice, and educate in the
Mm.
process.
I love that. I love that. Yes. Um, okay. With that in mind, let's get into it for real this
Yeah.
time. So let's start with January. So we our approach is to list out some of the transits that feel the most relevant or maybe the most impactful in that month. So this is not everything, but it's going to give you a good overview of how the month is going to go. So on January 1st, Mercury stations direct at 22 degrees Sagittarius. On the 4th, Mars ingresses into Capricorn. The 13th, Mercury ingresses back into Capricorn. On the 19th, we have a Sun conjunction with Pluto in Capricorn. And then the next day, Pluto enters Aquarius and the Sun also enters Aquarius. And so we have this Sun Pluto conjunction for a couple days, exact conjunction. And then on the 23rd, Venus enters Capricorn. So, what stands out to you, Erin, about January?
I'm like, do we start with the elephant in the room or do we start with like hitting the ground running?
It's up to you.
Um,
Your call.
the elephant in the room being Pluto and Aquarius,
Yeah.
and the hitting the ground running for those who don't know is the January 1st Mercury stations direct. And maybe we can start there and like move
Hmm.
towards the Sun conjunction with Pluto because
Sure.
um, so Mercury as a mythologically as a god is the messenger with winged feet, um, which is why I said that like hitting the ground running. It's interesting that like Mercury stationing direct on the very first day of the Gregorian calendar.
Hmm.
Um, but it doesn't feel like, we have this idea that like Mercury stations direct, okay, we're moving quickly. And actually, that's not true for a stationary planet.
Mm. Hmm.
Whether the planet is stationing direct or retrograde, they're actually like moving, they're not moving. It's like a planet that is maybe spiraling in place, like Mercury's running in circles, not running forward
Hmm.
at that point. And
Hmm.
I think stationing direct in Sag, Mercury's running in circles around a Jupiterian idea because it's in a
Hmm.
Jupiter sign. And Mercury doesn't love being in a Jupiter ruled sign because Mercury likes to focus on details.
Hmm.
And Sagittarius, one of Jupiter's signs, is much more of a big picture focused, visionary field.
Yeah. Right.
But it feels like kind of like what we were talking about with like ritual strategy, right? It's like, well, what is the ethos? Like, what is the through line that you're
Mm.
wanting to carry? Like, this is a good day to run some circles around a few different concepts and
Hmm.
get a sense of what is it that you're wanting to, um, like, what's your mission statement for the year?
Yeah.
that you want to bring through. And like you have a few days to refine it. Like, Mercury's going to be slow to get moving again. It's like
Hmm.
a car that is like you start the car and it sort of sputters and then it stops and then you have to restart it and like
Yeah.
eventually it starts moving, but you're moving really slowly because you don't know if the car is working or not yet.
Hmm.
But then suddenly you're like on the wide open highway and um, you know where you're going and you're excited. You're finally off on your trip.
Hmm.
And yeah, this has like it has a lot of possibility if you can be with, you know, Mercury wants to do things. So like actually like refraining from checking off all your boxes. Like if you want to declutter, okay, fine. But if you are trying to do the entire year in one day,
Mm.
I don't know that I don't know that that would be the day for me to do that. It feels more like um what is the thing that is going to cohere my experience of the year
Hmm. Hmm.
conceptually? Like it's a time to like be with that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's making me think about like vision boarding or even creating like a
Mm,
playlist, and something that also stuck out to me about the start of this year being, marked by this Mercury stationing direct in Sagittarius is um, the Rilke quote about living into the question. I think that can be
mm,
an interesting thing to start off the year. Like, what are some of the questions that you're holding? What are you curious about exploring more deeply? Like, not just exploring in terms of gathering information, but like exploring in like an embodied way, right? And I think really feeling into one's intentions rather than like specific goals can be really helpful. Um,
mhm,
I also have been engaging in a couple days ago. An email came into my inbox. It's written by this person who is a tarot and general like cartomancy person named
mhm.
Camellia Elias, and she had written about the 12 days of omens practice that she has, which I find really fascinating actually. So the idea is essentially starting December 26th, the day after Christmas, you would just look out at your window at 12 p.m. and 12 a.m. Every day, and you just see something that's an omen, and then like write it down, and then let that be the guiding omen or the guiding imagery for your month. And I'm not saying that you necessarily have to do that, but I think this is kind of the approach, right? The ethos, as you mentioned, Erin, that can be really interesting to start the year with, rather than kind of getting so bogged down into specifics, which you can do once Mars or once Mercury goes back into Capricorn, right? Um, I think and Mars is also in Capricorn, by the way, by the time Mercury gets into Capricorn. So then it's like, Sergeant General is like right there. We're ready to hit the ground running. But I think beginning with more of this open ended question or feeling more into the vibe is kind of the name of the game this year. Hmm.
Yeah. And we don't get a lot of time to do that this year. Like
Mm,
this is like one of the few moments where like not a ton is happening.
yeah.
Um, so it's sort of like savor it if you can.
Hmm.
Um, you know, for folks who work day jobs too, just like if you're going back to work, like things can sometimes be slow to start in the new year. It's like savor that extra time, little bit of time that you might have from not having too much on your plate because
Hmm.
it will get busy.
Yeah.
It's so funny that you mentioned the 12 days of omens. I just had a client session right before this, and my client was doing the same thing. And I've never heard about it. So, twice in one day, I'm going to take that as an omen.
It's so
Um,
good. It's been so interesting actually too to notice for myself internally what when do I decide or how do I decide if something is an omen or not. um yeah,
yeah.
so that's
And
fascinating.
that's a like choosing with the body
Hmm.
practice of
Hmm.
like, what is my gut telling me is the omen?
Yeah, yeah, I mean a lot of magic is actually about deciding, right, on
Hmm.
like this is the kind of experience I want to have, this is the
Yeah.
kind of thing or energy that I want to place my attention into.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. It feels like preparation too for the Jupiter Uranus conjunction that happens later in the first half of the year. Just this like emphasis on synchronicity, and like felt synchronicity, which I think is an interesting concept to tap into during Capricorn season, because all of the planets moving through Capricorn are going to be trining Jupiter and then Uranus. And we don't pay it that much attention to trines because they're harmonious. There's not a lot of friction. They don't tend to cause a ton of upset. Like maybe they speed us up, like we're rolling down the hill and we take a tumble, or we're running down the hill and we tumble and we get down the hill faster, but we still somehow land on our feet, you know? They tend to be a little bit easier, but it's a great moment to feel into, or to like develop a synchronicity practice. It's like looking for the good, being able to locate the ease even amidst rupture, because this year has so many sharp turns. So
So,
establishing that as a practice is like
yeah,
a great thing in January.
I agree. I agree. That's really good advice. So let's talk about the first rupture then, with this
Yeah.
Pluto leaving Capricorn. Is there anything else you want to say before we go into that?
Well, yeah, maybe just like the Mars ingress into Capricorn on the 4th. Mars is exalted in Capricorn. And as we talked about, it's like your best friend bringing out the best in you. Because like a planet in exaltation, it doesn't own the house, but it's like staying with somebody who is like the ideal mentor who can help you like refine your talents and suppress your faults or your defects. And we all have them. So, no shame. But Mars tends to be really rash and move really quickly, and that can get Mars into trouble. And, Mars is a planet of assertion and protection and force, and often conflict and friction. But like it's the conflict and friction that comes with being able to confront something, which can often cause like repelling away, um, or division. Severance is like a Mars thing. And uh, Mars in Capricorn has the patience of being in like Saturn's domain. It's grounded because it's in an earth sign, and it slows Mars down in order to think strategically, but Mars is still Mars and can take action.
Yes.
So Mars ingressing into Capricorn, followed by Mercury picking up speed and moving back into Capricorn on the 13th, just it really sets us up to like structure our year or plan for our year, but in a way that is like actually checking things off of the to-do list. Like if there's anything that you really need to get done, that's like a huge priority for the year, and you have the capacity to do it or get a huge chunk of it done, January is the time to do it. Because there's again so many like sharp turns, whereas January is like it's like a slow acceleration, and like on a straightaway, you know, which is when you have the wind at your back, you can get a little bit further. So if you can figure out your intention and your focus and start to make some headway towards it, this is a good time.
Yeah. Yeah. Mars and Capricorn, one of the keywords that I associate with that placement is also prioritization, like getting clear about what one's priorities are and then being able to appropriately allocate energy towards that which you actually care about, rather than letting it kind of be splattered in all kinds of different
Definitely.
directions. Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, now we can talk about the elephant.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah, this is a pretty This is a pretty big one, right? Because with Pluto moving into Aquarius, well, this is kind of a multi-year process. I was actually doing a little bit of a research around this, and I noticed that last year Pluto ingressed into Aquarius and spent about 2.5 months there. But
Hmm.
this year, Pluto is spending 9.5 months in Aquarius, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So we're kind of having this inverted experience where last year we had a little bit, like almost 3 months of Pluto in Aquarius, whereas this year we have mostly Pluto in Aquarius with a little bit, a little under a quarter of the year with Pluto back in Capricorn. So, um,
Yeah. I think
mhm,
also it's worth noting that last year Pluto entered Aquarius right after Mars finally entered Cancer after like 6 months in Gemini, and right after Saturn entered Pisces. And so the Pluto entering into Aquarius last year was, I don't want to say confused, but it there was like a fog around it just by the fact that
mhm,
there were other really big energetic shifts happening at the same time.
yes.
And there wasn't really anything else happening in Aquarius. So um, we didn't have a ton more information. Planets, especially outer planets, tend to show themselves more when they get hit by a conjunction or square or opposition from another planet, and especially the moon. And so we had some lunar transits to Pluto while it was in Aquarius, but we got like you know how a really good movie preview doesn't tell you the story of the whole movie?
Mm-hmm.
It like hooks you and you're like excited to see the film. And you actually have no idea what the film is about, but it's like super beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's what we got with Pluto and Aquarius. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's super beautiful, but like it's almost too hard to tell still. But we got a movie preview and we have no idea what the movie's about. Or
Mm-hmm.
we have like the tiniest inkling because we have some imagery to work with. And a lot of it is still conjecture.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this year, I think we're going to get more of a solid um, like introduction,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially because the like Pluto enters Aquarius, and then we get Mercury in Aquarius, and then we get Mars in Aquarius, and then we get Venus in Aquarius. And so we're getting a number of planets very quickly joining Pluto and showing us, bringing out the flavor of Pluto by association.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Um, what are your thoughts, Erin, about this last Pluto Sun conjunction in Capricorn before
Yeah.
it actually moves into Aquarius?
Yeah, this is super interesting because the exact conjunction happens at 29 degrees and 59 minutes in Capricorn, which is like the very last minute. But what's interesting about the luminaries, the sun and the moon, is that they actually take up like they actually occupy about a third of a degree.
Mm.
So we might think that it's like just a minute, but if every degree has 60 minutes, they're actually occupying about 20 minutes, which
Mm.
means that the sun is technically partially already in Aquarius
Mm.
when it's making this conjunction to Pluto. And so it
Mm-hmm.
really feels like it's carrying Pluto into Aquarius. Um, and I think what's interesting about it to me is that Pluto's an underworld god.
Yeah.
And you and I have talked a lot about Dionysus. And I think it was Meg Keane Meg Third Sister on Instagram, wrote a newsletter earlier this year about the sun and Dionysus and like what happens when the sun goes under the earth or like crosses to the nether world of the other hemisphere. So like
Mm-hmm.
basically every night
Yeah.
the sun goes into the underworld. And this is a very Dionysian um, thing that the sun does. It's like a frenzy. It leaves the day, and in its absence creates the night. And from a like mythological perspective, when the sun is underneath the earth, it's in Pluto's realm. Like the fourth house would be probably Pluto's house if the
Mm-hmm.
third house is Persephone's house.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's something about Dionysian consciousness that deals with like purge and liberation, like the heating so much that we release toxins, or like fermentation of grapes to make wine, as an example. Things happen when the sun gets really close.
Mm-hmm.
But then also fermentation usually happens in a very dark space.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also thinking about compost. Like compost usually needs heat and dark.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the sun is with Pluto, it's like sort of in this like shadow land, but it's lighting it up. It's literally lighting up the shadows. So just in terms of what it's doing, especially because Capricorn and Aquarius are both ruled by Saturn, there's a like emphasis on how the sun is showing us that it's not that different, but it's still different. It's like we're
Mm-hmm.
changing the tone, but we're singing the same note. Is that a
Yeah.
thing? That's got to be a thing.
Or like
You're the
maybe,
musician here.
maybe, yes, changing the tone but still singing the same song or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, just
Mm-hmm.
like changing the
Shifting
pitch.
parts. Yeah.
Yeah,
In a chorus.
yeah. And yeah, I don't know. There's um, Pluto in Capricorn was really about showing us the systemic rot that we have all over the
Mm-hmm.
world. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you look at so many of the eruptions in communities speaking about educating about systems of oppression, and rebelling against them, and the very real fear that spreads quickly when we understand that the systems that are supposedly designed to take care of us don't,
Mm.
and needing to care for ourselves, and like learning how selfish and like awful humanity can be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I feel like is part of how Pluto operates, and I think we're going to continue to see some of that with Pluto in Aquarius.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I have more ideas that I want to talk about, but I want to hear your thoughts on like Pluto leaving Capricorn with the sun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a more micro and then maybe a more macro example, I think, to kind of illustrate what I'm trying to say here. I think the more micro example is the experience of being an adult child, and how
Mm,
we have, when we're thinking about Pluto in Capricorn, a lot of it has been about unraveling and understanding power structures and power dynamics, right? And power dynamics are not necessarily always implying abuse either, right? It's just
right.
this was the structure that was necessary in order to get things done when you were 5 up until you were 17, But I think
Mm-hmm.
the experience of being an adult child is about taking a stock, an honest look at like who you are right now, the resources you do have right now, and the difference between who you are now versus when you were 15, and that difference will necessitate a certain kind of rearrangement of the way that you structure your relationship with your parents because you are not a 15-year-old anymore. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's much easier for us. I mean, I can definitely attest to this. When I'm an adult, to just simply kind kind of offload all that burden into my parents when actually that's no longer the case right now, right? And it's like the hard work of like updating the software of that relationship is to me kind of a nice analogy for like Pluto going from Capricorn into Aquarius, because you're moving into a different power structure. Doesn't mean that the new power structure is necessarily better, but perhaps it's more a reflection of your current resources and where you currently are, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I think the more macro example that I had was, really thinking about politics and finance as being more of this, how we got things done back in the days, right? In the early 20th century. And then tech is kind of the new way. But I think there's this idea, right, that when we're thinking about Aquarius in general, that, oh, when we are, that tech is just going to save us automatically, which I think is not true, right? And I think Pluto in Aquarius is about an investigation of that, because how much of the structures that we that are kind of underpinning some of these new ways of being, of looking at things, are actually simply recreation of older structures.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. It's reminding me too of the relationship, like the physical relationship between Pluto and the sun. Like the sun is the center of the solar system,
Mm.
and Pluto is like way out there on the invisible edge. Like Saturn's the visible limit, but Pluto's the sort of, I don't even know if I want to call it the invisible limit, because what does that even mean? But it reminds me of like that like moment in Mean Girls at the in the mathlete final finale where she's like, the limit does not exist. The limit does not exist. Um, and I think Pluto, like the becoming an adult child and like hashing through all of your childhood trauma, it's like the horrors just keep going. If you go in if you look at the history of the world, the history of humanity, like, and you keep digging, you will dig until you get to the other side of the earth, and the horrors will keep revealing themselves. Like you can dig in
Mm-hmm.
the shadows forever. It's a shadow.
Yeah.
And Pluto often represents shadows. Um, but at some point, you have to shift to looking at different shadows because it's not actually
Mm.
getting you anywhere.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
not making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that Pluto often represents is obsession.
Mm.
So it's like we can obsess as much as we want about how the system isn't working. Uh, and you can keep going forever and ever and ever. And at some point, you have to try to create a different system or work
Mm-hmm.
within a different system or
Mm-hmm.
join um, the masses into in creating the new system.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing that. I know we're going to talk about AI at some point because that is the natural evolution of Pluto and Aquarius. Um, and like one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is like there's no stopping AI.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's going like we could try to rally the masses, but it's kind of like climate change, right? Like we're doing the best we can to like shift the energy and the focus and the purpose and the actions that people are taking to in order to better take care of the earth
Mm-hmm.
and ourselves, because the earth is our home.
Mm-hmm.
And we also know that certain systems are going to keep doing what they're doing. And that doesn't mean that we stop trying.
Mm-hmm.
But with AI, for example, we're in this really interesting moment where a lot of people's desire is going to be to push it away because they don't want to learn and they think that it's horrifying and it's going to ruin us. And it's possibly true, but it's like the person who doesn't want the power is one of the best people for the job because they understand the weight of the responsibility of the power and they can actually, they're concerned with the people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the people who are pushing AI away because they know that AI isn't good for us, in a way, might be signing us over to a future where AI has a lot of like thoughts and ideas and coding for like more of a white supremacist, patriarchal, misogynist, so on and so forth, oppressive society, or they could contribute to the superhuman giant computer dimension,
Mm-hmm.
artificial intelligence dimension,
Mm-hmm.
and make sure that that intelligence includes dreams of things that we want to see, includes healthy collaboration between humans and computers, includes respect and reverence, and like views it in a way that, um, yeah, is it's a better world than the one that they fear. But they have to move through the fear in order to do it. And
Mm-hmm.
Pluto, son of Saturn, it deals with our fears, deals with the
Mm-hmm.
fears that we obsess about. And so
Yeah.
it's like when you first try working with any kind of astrological magic, even if it's benefic, the sometimes it won't actually bring a good thing to you. It will just highlight the thing that you don't have so
Mm.
that you can learn to cope with that or take action. It's like if you're working with some kind of magic that deals with sovereignty, and you spend a day feeling trapped, it's showing you how free you don't feel and how
Mm-hmm.
much you need to feel freedom, and that you might have to effort a little bit more to and participate in the creation of that experience,
Yeah.
which like some people might see as like capitalist, like that idea of like pick yourself up by your bootstraps, but um the like the new world doesn't come out of our laziness. Like it still requires our participation.
Yeah. 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 It's making me think about mm-hmm, the idea of like what it means to really be in flow, right? This is something that I've been
Mm,
contemplating a lot recently because to me, what I know to not be in flow is either avoidance or resistance, right? And in some
mm-hmm,
ways, resistance can look like fighting something, or resistance can also look like kind of not wanting to deal. That's also some sort of resistance. And I think what I'm really paying attention to with this particular transit, but also throughout 2024, is how are we talking about artificial and alternative intelligence?
mm-hmm.
Right? What are some
And
of the
how are we talking to
stories?
it?
How are we talking to it, and what stories do we have around it? Right, including in popular media, like in TV and movies, because a lot of the times, I think art can really show us what is within our unconscious, but we can only see that if we are willing to see it.
Mm-hmm,
We can only actually see that we are only highlighting a sliver of our experience if we are committed to seeing it as a sliver of our experience, right? If we think that's the whole pie, then we think that's the whole pie, you know? And so,
mm-hmm,
um, yeah, I think about how AI and just in general technological advancement is also shifting, like always shifting our definition of what it means to be human. That
mm-hmm,
that question isn't supposed to lead you to a fixed answer, right? Recently, I was hearing someone named Daniel Fraga talking about ontological design in Leah Garza's Container. And something he said that really kind of um, opened my eyes to this quite literally is imagine the world before glasses were invented, right? We would just,
mm-hmm,
if we have um, nearsightedness, we would just be able to see what we're able to see, and the rest of the world is fuzzy, right? But now that, contact lenses, glasses are so widely available, it expands our definition of what humans are capable of. And so, in some
Hmm.
ways, I think this next stage of technological leap will also force us to reconsider our preconceived notions about what it means to be human.
Hmm. Yeah. I think it's also like Pluto compounds, right?
Mm,
And um, Aquarius, Gemini, Libra, Virgo, they're all signs whose symbols are human.
mm,
Like Gemini, the twins, Aquarius, the water bearer, like a human literally carrying water. Um, Maybe less so Libra, the scales. Sometimes you see Lady Justice with the scales.
mhm,
Virgo, um, being the Virgin.
mhm,
And so when we have Pluto in those signs, we see like an evolution in humanity. And I think about Pluto as like exponential pressure, right?
mm,
Like the atomic bomb is like associated with Pluto as an example. Um, like the compression of atoms.
mhm,
But like what does it mean when our evolution is compressed?
mm,
And I think that biologically it would be very difficult for us to evolve physically in the 20-year period that Pluto is in Aquarius. But at the same time, we're seeing like these crazy developments in like plastic surgery and Botox and like medical equipment and procedures that defy age.
mm,
Um,
mhm,
and we have to consider that technology is like AI is a step in our evolution as humans.
mhm.
Like
Yeah.
the computer has a brain that probably has more capacity than our brains. And like we've been cyborgs for a while,
Mhm,
if we think about it that way. Um, but I think we're going to see a lot more visuals of what it means to um, have like a hybrid human and computer. Like that'll be a theme in movies, of course,
mhm,
but also like in real day-to-day life, like prosthetic legs becoming like robotic legs. You know, there are
mhm.
things that will be certainly helpful and desired and exciting for some folks. And then there's always going to be a shadow side of those things, you know,
Yeah.
like the invention of the toilet
Mhm,
uh, keeps diseases away because we're able to flush things. But then we have all of this sewage buildup somewhere that
mm,
we don't know where. And like that could be really bad for the earth and like you know, the wasting of water. I saw something about a law that was passed in California that allows scientists to explore the treatment of sewage for recycling for drinking water,
mm,
which sounds really gross, but also is a conservation effort. Like that feels very Pluto and Aquarius because Aquarius, Saturn is traditionally an agricultural god that deals with irrigation.
mhm,
So if we're looking at Capricorn and Aquarius, we're looking at irrigation systems, which
mm,
can be communication systems. They can be like channels of communication, but also like literal like irrigation pipes,
mhm.
um, and that's emphasized by Saturn's presence in Pisces, of course,
Yeah.
in a water sign. But
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah, just on the thread of cyborgs and technology and using technology or directing or influencing technology for the benefit of the masses or changing the way that we think about it as it relates to systems of oppression or systems of support.
Mhm,
Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto might be a good thing for folks to read and as
mhm.
they're contemplating Pluto and Aquarius.
Yeah. I'm going to include that in the show note as well. Mhm. Cool. How do you feel about moving on to February, Erin?
Yeah, I feel like I could go on forever about
I
Pluto
know.
and Aquarius. Maybe there'll need to be like a separate episode just for that, but we can definitely
I
start to
think
shift
so.
because
Yeah.
I mean, we're not avoiding the Pluto conversation for the rest of the 6 months.
I feel like it's
Let's
gonna
do
it's
it.
gonna continue to come up. Yeah. Um so on February the 4th, Mercury enters Aquarius and conjoins Pluto. On the 12th, Mars enters Aquarius and then conjoins Pluto on the 14th. On the 16th, Venus enters Aquarius. On the 18th, the Sun enters Pisces. The 21st, Venus will conjoin Mars at 6 degrees Aquarius. And on the 22nd, Mercury enters Pisces. Um, what feels the most relevant to you here, Erin, that you feel
Mm,
you want
I
to talk
think we
about?
can just like mention the um it's like it's an Aquarius party for most
Mm-hmm.
of the month.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we're just following up on the thread that we just talked about, like we're gonna get to know Pluto in Aquarius, um, because Pluto is throwing a party in Aquarius, and every time a new guest arrives to the party, the vibe of the party changes.
Mm-hmm.
It's like somebody new shows up and is like vibe check, and then somebody else shows up and is like vibe check, like how's it going, guys?
Yeah.
Um, so we're going to, with Mercury, Mars, Venus, we're going to get to know Pluto in Aquarius by association. It's like that idea that uh, somebody is like you measure somebody by their friends, or their friends are a reflection of a person.
Mm.
I don't know that I would say that all of these planets are Pluto's friends necessarily, but they're certainly there to contribute to the Plutonian conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And um, the like overall theme that I would say to folks is, again, every month we have a stellium, which is a grouping of 3 or more planets in one sign, shifting from one sign to another for the first half of the year. So like January is like Capricorn party. February
Mm.
is Aquarius party. And
Mm-hmm.
not all of the planets are entering the signs at the same time, clearly, but that's it's a good thing to think about if you're trying to plan for your year, just like what part of my life am I going to be dealing with this month? And you
Mm.
can look to the house that contains that sign to get more information about that. So, for example, February is like I have a Capricorn rising chart. So, Aquarius is my second house. I'm probably going to be doing my taxes in February and like looking at financial stuff and
Mm.
doing some resource planning
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about the planets in my chart that are in Aquarius that are being impacted by all of these ingresses. And I know that that month of the year is going to be focused on that area of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And then when things move into Pisces, March, that month of the year, I'm going to be focused on more like immediate environment, maybe doing a lot of things with friends because it's the third house, which deals with like neighborly items. I also have some other plans for March, which I'll talk about later, but
Mm-hmm.
just paying attention to what sign is in the house that, or what house the sign that everything is in
Mm-hmm.
is being activated while
For
it's
that
happening.
particular month. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I also was thinking about recently I was listening to Adrienne Marie Brown's older podcast episode, and I think in that particular episode they were talking about writing these choral pieces um, and then recording them with a choir and intentionally not being present or not singing in the recording for the second half of of the batch of
Mm.
recordings. And then when they sent it to their friends could swear, like, these are the people that knew them, could swear that they were on the recording. So that's kind of the vibe I'm getting here as well. That, it's kind of like sometimes you know your favorite artist better through the collaborations they do with other people, because bringing in another voice into their project actually brings more of that flavor of them, so that's kind of what I'm feeling for um the stellium of
Yeah, especially
planets
with
coming
Pluto.
into Pluto.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I feel that.
yeah.
And I think like remembering that it's going to like each planet is going to bring um its own purpose
Mm,
or agenda to Pluto.
mhm,
Pluto's sitting there. Um, Pluto again deals with like hyper focus and obsession and power, you
mm,
know? So like Mercury is youths, like kids, messengers, craftspeople, like uh, you know, Mercury of all the planets has a lot more potential jobs and agendas than any other planet.
mhm,
So it'll be interesting to see Mercury conjoining Pluto because it's, I think, one of the more neutral energies. But Mars's agenda is conflict. So, like the Mars Pluto conjunction on February 14th, that feels interesting given that it's on Valentine's Day. Um, yeah, that sounds like power dynamics within couples.
mm,
One thing that we didn't talk about with Pluto and Aquarius, because there's going to be like Pluto often deals with like big generational changes and evolutions. I am expecting to see even more uh, conversation, like public conversation around polyamory
mm,
and the
mhm,
shadow side of it,
mhm,
like both the good things and the hard things,
mhm,
and just like shifting relationships. Because Aquarius is the group, right? It's the
mhm,
group, the crowd, and all of the ways that like polyamory doesn't have to mean multiple romantic relationships. It just means many different ways, like the capacity to love multiple people at the same
mm,
time.
mhm,
And so we might see more folks home sharing
mm,
and like sharing the domestic challenges and needs.
mhm,
But Mars joining Pluto uh, is going to show us the ruptures in the group dynamics,
mhm.
is one of those things that I feel like we might see.
Yeah, yeah.
And speaking of Mars, the Venus Mars conjunction on February 21st feels really
Mhm,
important
mhm.
to
I was
talk about.
gonna, I was gonna ask you to talk about that because that one feels big to me too. Mhm,
Yeah. I think it feels big because last summer Venus was retrograde in Leo, and when Venus entered Leo, like the whole summer, even before Leo, Venus was just tracing the same path that Mars was tracing and trying to catch up.
mhm,
And they almost conjoined in Leo, but Venus slowed down to station retrograde, and Mars left and entered Virgo, and so they never caught up with one another.
yeah.
So whatever was happening last summer, I feel like we're going to see um, a return of some of those themes,
Mm,
but from a totally flipped perspective because it's in the opposite sign that they're finally making their conjunction. And
mhm,
Venus Mars conjunctions are like notorious for um, stories of like being unfaithful or yeah, just like sometimes we see betrayals happen.
mm, mhm,
And I think that the cool thing about this happening in Aquarius is like Leo's a sign of loyalty, right? Like the sun deals with loyalty and steadfastness and coherence. And it's not that Aquarius isn't loyal. But it's much more big picture focused. It's loyal to the hive mind, right?
Mm,
Like to the
mm-hmm,
group.
mm-hmm,
And it's also like at the edge, Saturn isolates itself. It's more independent. And so it feels like almost the possibility of the loyalty that we thought we were looking for, or that we thought we were the connection that we thought we were chasing last summer. We realized like, oh, we were actually trying to pick a fight that wasn't a thing that we needed to fight for. And suddenly there's this emphasis on like independence, lending healthy structure.
mm.
And I don't know, maybe I'm being naive about it, but Mars Venus conjunctions are always good for Mars, bad for Venus.
Yeah, yeah. This is an interesting one too because I feel like, well, because you pointed this particular transit out, I started looking at the other Venus Mars conjunctions in the past few years. And
Mhm,
we've had a Venus Mars conjunction in Aquarius in March 2022. But before that, it was mostly kind of in the last 8 years, we've had it in Virgo and Leo. And then starting
mhm,
2026, they will be in Capricorn and Cancer. So I think this
mhm,
Aquarius flavor here, kind of in the middle, if we look at it, in the past, like, I actually was looking at this in terms of like 20 years from 2013. So, like, last 10
mhm.
years, the coming 10 years, um, it kind of feels to me like there's a flavor here around opening up to ways of being to resource us for deeper, truer, maybe more kind of rooted connection in the future.
Definitely.
That there's something here
Definitely.
about like an interruption of patterns that we've been engaging with so that we know how to better be with what we truly, truly want, kind of separate from the pattern and the container, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And I think that's highlighted also. I love that you're bringing up the one from March of 2022 because Venus was besieged after that. Like Venus
Mm,
and Mars conjoined, and she was bodily besieged. So, bodily besiegement is when a planet um, is separating from one malefic, so Mars or Saturn, and then applying to another in the same sign. So, Venus was separating from Mars in Aquarius, applying to Saturn in Aquarius. And it's like you're trapped on either side with like
ouch.
planets that tend to be harmful and hurtful and
Mm-hmm,
negative, like life reducing in some way, shape, or form,
mm-hmm,
um, causing friction. And in this particular case, I'm pretty sure Venus conjoins Mars and then squares Jupiter, who she rules in
mm-hmm,
Taurus.
mm-hmm.
I'm not exactly positive about that, but I'm pretty sure that's the first aspect that she makes. Yeah, let me just check that really quick. Uh, and I think that um, it gives a totally different feel from it's almost like we learned something the last time
Mm,
about remembering also that Saturn ruled signs are a planet are times where we like take space, we isolate, we rest. We do focus on like independence and like meeting the harsh realities. And
mm-hmm,
it's almost like the last time Venus didn't want to meet the harsh reality. The reality was too harsh, and like the way that you look at like there was no place to look that wasn't harsh. Whereas making a square to Jupiter, even though it's a square, there's some hope. There's some like hope for an alternative desire
mm-hmm,
that we hadn't thought of
mm-hmm.
or that we weren't willing to let in before.
Yeah.
And she's kind of running the show because she rules Jupiter
Mm-hmm,
in Taurus. So
mm-hmm,
it feels like there's a mitigating factor. And like Venus Jupiter aspects can be a little bit overdone. Like what's the word? Like like overindulgent. Um, but like coming off of uh, being wounded, it's like really nice to go take a bath and like, go take care of yourself, light a candle, light some incense,
Yeah.
whatever it is that you do to feel a little bit better. There's
Mm-hmm.
some cushy support on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like that. Yeah. Shall we do March?
Yeah.
Okay. So in March, on the 9th, we have Mercury entering Aries, the 11th, Venus entering Pisces, the 19th, the Sun enters Aries, and then the 21st, Venus conjoins Saturn in Pisces, the 22nd, Mars enters Pisces, and then on the 25th, we have this lunar eclipse in Aries Libra. So
Mm.
I would say, March seems more straightforward to me, except for this lunar
Really?
eclipse. It feels more straightforward to me. I'm curious to hear your experience just looking at this.
That's so funny. I kind of feel the opposite.
Really?
And yeah, because eclipse season is like a eclipse season gives us like huge 180s
Mm.
often.
Mm-hmm.
The nodes are not, they're points in the sky, they're not actual planets.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Even though they're like talked about in Vedic tradition, for example, like in the grouping of planets, they're certainly bodies, but they're shadows. They are the point at which the sun and the moon intersect, like their orbits intersect relative to the Earth. And so they're these like moments of perfect alignment where the sun and the moon are exactly opposite or exactly together relative to the Earth. And eclipse season always feels like it's filled with surprises.
Mm.
And okay, less surprises than usual, given that we've already had an eclipse season in Libra Aries this past season. But even that was
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, we know what the story is, with everything happening in October, November and into right now of 2023. Um, so I was listening to another forecast earlier this week with Austin and Gordon um, White, I think is his last
Mm.
name.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about how 2024 is a little bit like, is this World War III? Is this World War III? And there can be a lot of, yeah, I think there's a lot of unknowns, but it's very martial.
Mm.
Eclipse season that starts in March because the North Node is in Aries and the Sun is joining it. And eventually Mars is going to move into Aries in like a month and a half or so after that. And then right in the middle of eclipse season, which isn't happening in March, but like we get the beginnings of the pre-retrograde shadow, we have a Mercury retrograde.
Mm.
So March to me feels like when things start to kind of pop off. And it almost feels like clues to something that isn't the thing, like
Mm-hmm.
things that lead you astray in a
Yeah,
way.
definitely. I got
Um,
that vibe too.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like to me, here's my take on March. It feels like what it's leading us into, or let me put it this way. It's like, one of those movies where the beginning seems really boring and then you actually realize a lot of damage has been done halfway through the movies
Mm.
and then the rest
Hmm.
is just like what even happened. That's what I mean by it's kind of like the experience of it feels quiet and gentle to me, especially thinking about the South Node in Libra ruled by that really sweet exalted Venus in Pisces, right?
Hmm.
But there's kind of a tricky quality to it. And I'm also paying attention to how both Mars and Venus are co present with Neptune right? And Neptune kind of plays a big part in another eclipse later this year, right? Where
Right.
I think the moon is pretty close to Neptune
Hmm.
on that one. So yeah, this one is in general, we always say within the astrology community that magic is not recommended during eclipses. I feel like this one
Hmm.
is like one of those things where it's like super not recommended, because
Hmm.
it can, you might be amplifying a process that A, you don't know how it's going to turn out. There's like a certain level of unpredictability. And B, it might be like a trap within like a I don't want to be too like negative about it, but it's almost like a nice, you know, quiet field, and then you fell down into like this really painful trap. Is kind of what I'm thinking with this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny. I'm looking at the astrology now. Like I'm reviewing all of the transits and I'm like, well, stuff doesn't really start to take off until like the 21st. It's
Mm-hmm.
like until
Mm-hmm.
Aries, like while things are in Pisces season, like it's still pretty chill. Like
Mm-hmm.
Mercury enters Aries, which is great for Mercury because it doesn't love being in Pisces.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit sharper in Aries, like a little bit more mental clarity. Then Venus enters Pisces and it's exalted. So like the first like 20 days of March 19 are I love all these TV examples for Pisces season too because it's such a visual like things in images, not in
Mm-hmm.
words.
Mm-hmm.
Um I went to my wife's family's for the holidays and we binge watched the 45th season of Survivor. And I don't know if anybody here is a Survivor fan, but there's like the way that they have it set up now. I don't know if it was always this way because I was not like a Survivor watcher when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the first few episodes, they're in like different tribes and they're like weeding people out and people get voted off the show. And then like partway through the season, they all merge into the same group and then they like go to tribal council and they'll vote people off. And the very first episode, like the people that you think are going to make it through are often like some of those people get voted off really quickly.
Mm.
Some of them are also people that you like expect, you like know that they're like not going to stick around.
Yeah.
um but it starts to get really interesting. Like
Mm-hmm.
the dynamics, but the social dynamics get really interesting partway through the season when the tribe merges, because at the end of the season, when they're in the final three, the last like 10 people to have gotten voted off, or the last seven people to have gotten voted off, are the people that vote for the person who wins. So
Wow.
you have to be like getting rid of people, but like keeping them like wanting to support you in the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah.
So it's this very like interesting dynamic. And it feels like March is that month where it merges and
Mm-hmm.
everything starts to come together. March and like maybe July, like June, July, but like June, July feels like a different turning point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, March is like, oh, it's getting interesting now. Like we're starting to see some of the social dynamics develop in a way that we didn't expect.
Mm-hmm.
And alliances get formed, like Venus conjunct Saturn on the 21st, right after the sun enters Aries. Venus Saturn conjunctions are like classic intergenerational relationships,
Mm.
long-term commitments. Like Venus is not a planet of commitment. Venus is a planet of desire and attraction. Saturn is a planet of like, let's make this thing a reality. So it's interesting that we get these like, okay, attraction and commitment come together to form an alliance
Mm-hmm.
on the 21st, right before Mars enters Pisces. And then suddenly you have both malefics in the same sign. And one of those malefics is ruling the North Node in Aries. And it almost feels like then we just have that like build up to the Mars Saturn conjunction, which I think doesn't happen actually until April. Yeah. But there's like it's almost like that buildup is like a distraction from the eclipse season. And we don't really know, we don't really know which planet to pay attention to here. So if you can keep your calendar mostly chill and clear end of March and into April, like that's a really good time to not plan to have a lot to do.
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
like make your alliances by the 21st. Like figure out who your collaborators are and make sure you're like in it.
Right. So this is interesting, Erin, because on April, right, we begin April with Mercury stationing retrograde. So, is it okay if we move into April?
Yeah, definitely.
So, the first of April, we have Mercury stationing retrograde at 27 degree Aries. On the 4th, we have Venus entering Aries. And the 8th, we have a solar total eclipse in Aries. The 10th, we have Mars conjoining Saturn in Pisces. The 19th, we have Sun entering Taurus. And then the 20th, we have Jupiter conjoining Uranus. 25th, Mercury finally stations direct. And then 29th, Venus enters Taurus. So April is busy. Like to me,
Mm-hmm.
April is like, wow, this is a lot, especially with that eclipse and then also with the Jupiter conjoining Uranus, which is this one's pretty significant to me. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. This is one of the bigger months of the year. I also am like quietly loving how, or not quietly, rather, how Mercury is really about the Gregorian calendar this year. Mercury's like Q1 station direct,
Yeah.
Q2 station retrograde. Mercury's like, I'm gonna be on time.
Totally.
Um, Mercury's like, we are starting every Gregorian moment with a spiral.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Totally.
Spiral is the name of the game. Yeah, and I think that's like a really key piece of April too, because we have again the eclipse is happening at the same time that Mercury's retrograde. So everything that we think is happening is not really it. Like, and I'm not saying like don't trust anything, but it's really um there's going to be a lot of, I think, internal urges to take action because of all of the energy in Aries. Like Aries has
Mm.
very low tolerance for discomfort, likes to do something to fix a situation or change it or confront a thing. It's very feisty. It can be a little bit rash. And it can be like it's very useful energy for visibility, but visibility isn't always a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's Mars is very strong when it enters Aries, which again that's coming in May, but Mars is like ruling everything from Pisces. It's a verse. So a verse is like making an angle where a planet can't see the
Mm-hmm.
other thing.
Yeah.
Um, so it's not it's a good time to be supporting Mars to function better, and still probably not necessarily helping the situation all that much, but it can ameliorate it a little bit. So all of the habit building that you're doing in the month of January, ritualizing your life, whatever you're picking up, whether it's like a meditation practice or qigong or yoga or breath work or writing, like whatever it is, like this is the moment to really give Mars something to do, like something useful to do, so that
Mm-hmm.
the energy doesn't come out quite as rash, or brash rather.
Yeah.
Uh, like this is a little chaotic.
I agree. I agree. I think this, at least in the beginning of the month, is a lot about how do you not believe everything you're feeling, not not believe all the information that's kind of coming in, right? And
Hmm.
there's a difference. I've been contemplating about the difference between validating your own experience versus um, creating a lot of hypothesis about where the other person's actions are coming from.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes we think, oh, I need to validate my own experience, therefore I need to make up or subscribe to these stories about the other person's motives. And I think that
Hmm.
actually can be really unhelpful. And rather
Hmm.
continuing to the practice of continuing back to, like, what am I experiencing right now? What is my experience telling me about my needs and my desires? And
Yeah.
tending to that almost like in a localized way, and not feeling like, especially when we feel like we're not getting something we want from a relationship or from another person or a community, um, that it's their responsibility to give that to us, you know?
Right. Right. Yeah, it's interesting to thinking about like how we react to people.
Mm.
Um, and this is one of those situations where the Mars conjunct Saturn buildup, the Mars Saturn conjunction happens on the 10th, might not be the worst for the collective astrology. Like Mars Saturn conjunctions can feel really frustrating because Mars wants to move really quickly and Saturn is like, slow down, buddy.
Mm-hmm.
So the experience I've heard it talked about is like driving with the emergency brake on, or like you can imagine like a glass that has been heated up and then you pour cold water into it,
Yeah.
or vice versa, and the glass breaks. Like that can happen with because Saturn is extremely cold and Mars is extremely hot. Um, but we can also think about them as balancing one another out. Like
Mm-hmm.
Saturn slows Mars down, Saturn cools Mars off. So if you can allow the buildup to the Mars Saturn conjunction to stay the reactivity a little bit, um, and not be frustrated at things not happening yet or not going the way that we want them to. Like the phrase that came to mind was like lash out irrationally. Like the thing that is happening in the Pisces part of your chart, um, versus the thing that is happening in the Aries part of your chart, one of them is going to feel like the thing, and it
Mm-hmm.
might actually be the other thing that you need to
Mm-hmm.
focus on.
Yeah.
And we don't really know. And I think the Mars Saturn thing can feel really distracting,
Mm-hmm.
because there's so much friction there. Like friction creates sparks, right? Um, but the eclipse is where the lasting change is going to be.
Mm.
That's the impact that eclipses tend to have. So that's the Aries part of our chart where stuff can feel like it's moving really fast. And in the very least, the sun is exalted in Aries.
Mm.
It does really well there when we're talking about like visibility. Um, and it's like the return of the light. The sun, what the sun needs to do is to be hot and to assert itself and to warm the earth and to show up each day. And like, the environment of Aries really supports the sun in doing that.
Yeah.
Um, I wouldn't suggest that people try to force things during eclipse season, like definitely not. But
Mm.
if there's a way to focus on like honing the Aries part of the chart, like calming it down, cooling it off enough in order to take more strategic action, I think um, that can be helpful. I mean, it's a solar total eclipse in Aries, which means it's a new moon, which uh, I think like the moon is new moons tend to be like exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
And this one I
Mm-hmm.
think is, it's a lot of energy on the North Node.
Yeah.
Um, and Venus is co-present with it, ruling the South Node, but like in Aries.
Mm-hmm.
So um, there's a emphasis on wanting to be seen. And like, remember that we don't really want to be seen as being reactive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, remember what you want to be seen for and
Yeah.
try to show up as that person if there's
Right.
anything that you can do.
Right. Right. I like what you're bringing in here about um, Mars also connected to Saturn during kind of this time period, because I think it may be really helpful to reorient to why you wanted that visibility in the first place, right? Like
Hmm.
oftentimes we want visibility because there's some sort of um, like bigger picture agenda that we are trying to accomplish, or some unmet need that we feel we need to tend to, right? So really
Hmm.
questioning, is visibility the best way to achieve that? Maybe an interesting question when it comes
Yeah.
to this point of the year. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's like, is it visibility that you're seeking? Is it like, is there an outcome that you're seeking? Like sometimes also eclipse season tends to like you have like a deck of cards and the deck gets thrown up in the air and the cards land where they land. And there's
Mm-hmm.
not a lot that you can do to control where they land.
Right. Right.
Or you like roll the die. Like they tend to be um out of our hands.
Mm-hmm.
And like it's stuff that is meant to happen.
Yeah.
And it's less about controlling outcomes and more about how we respond to what's happening while it's happening. Like, who do you want to be? How do you want to be
Mm-hmm.
in relationship to these like macro world events and how they impact you? Like, what do you want to be able to say about how you handled rupture?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, um, eclipses on the North Node tend to create they're creative eclipses. Like North Node creates things, South Node rejects or um,
Compost things.
severs things, composts things, releases
Mm-hmm.
things.
Yeah.
So North Node eclipses are bringing new things in. It's like, how do you want to respond to what's new that's being brought into your life? Do you want to welcome it? Do you want
Mm.
to push it away? Do you want to give it a tour? Um, what's appropriate too, depending on what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I
Should we
like
talk
that.
about Taurus?
Let's do it. Yeah, this one's interesting because I almost see, and we're gonna talk about May in a second, but I almost see this like 1 month period of like Jupiter's last um trip through the land of Taurus before entering
Hmm.
Gemini as like kind of really starting here, right? With this conjoining with Uranus. Um, this is kind of a big cycle. This is part of like a larger cycle. So Jupiter conjoins Uranus every 13 years. The last time we had it was January 2011. Next time we will have it is September 2037, right? And yeah, it's interesting because this one, for some reason, I was feeling the impulse to get a little nerdy, and I was curious about what Richard Tarnas would say, and this is what he wrote in Cosmos and Psyche. In world transits, the cyclical alignment of Jupiter and Uranus correlated consistently with condensed waves of celebrated milestones of creative or emancipatory activity across many fields. The conjunction of the two planets occurs approximately every 14 years. During each of these, as well as during the intervening oppositions, decisive crests of remarkably synchronous breakthroughs and innovations appeared to take place within a brief period of time in many areas of human activity. And then some examples are Kepler and Galileo separately made the public discoveries that confirmed the Copernican theory of the solar system. And then around 1900, psychoanalysis and quantum theory were sprouting up. And then 1858, Darwin kind of came up with the theory of evolution alongside Alfred Russel Wallace. So this is all, I think, super fascinating, kind of mundane astrology data. And I don't know, I'm curious, Erin, what have you noticed about Uranus and Taurus, and what do you feel might be coming up around this transit?
Yeah. Oh, so much. Thanks for that introduction and the quote from Rick Turnus.
Mm-hmm.
The I just want to mention like the shift into Taurus season on the 19th when the sun enters Taurus, like we leave behind eclipse season and we enter like a totally different field.
Mm-hmm.
Because suddenly all of the energy shifts away from what's happening in Aries and Pisces and onto the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. So it can feel like a really quick, like um, almost like whiplash, but like the image that I'm getting is like the Barbie movie where they're in Barbie land and then they're like on the road and then they're in the real world and then they're on the road again and then they're in
Mm,
Barbie land, like that shift from like different worlds to like the limbo or
yeah.
the different transitory space. uh this feels like one of those moments where we snapped our fingers and we
Mm-hmm.
teleported
Mm-hmm.
into Taurus land. Yeah, like Jupiter's primary function is growth in a way that coheres into a holistic experience.
Mm,
So it's not the type of growth that like stagnates or like roots us anywhere, even though it's Taurus. Like Jupiter functionally as a planet
mm,
is to expand our understanding or our perception or our worldview in a way that affirms from a from every angle, but it's not like pointing out the individual angles until it's
mm-hmm.
maybe in Gemini.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's like it's very much from a like in this way, I think it feels from like an embodied perspective because it's Taurus.
Mm,
Um, but I think if we can understand that Jupiter's job is to cohere and affirm and like affirm in a way that is um, it's like when you work really hard to build a business as an entrepreneur and your business explodes, it's like you did all that work before the business exploded, and the explosion in a good way, not in
not
an
in a
implosion.
crumbling, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but like overnight success is like Jupiter coming and affirming all of the work that you did, as an
Mm,
example.
mm-hmm.
And Jupiter's conjunction with Uranus really feels like it's affirming a lot of the things that Uranus has been doing in Taurus since it entered Taurus in 2018,
Mm-hmm.
which was also in May. It was May 15th, I think, of 2018 that Uranus entered Taurus. So, oh, this is April. My bad. Yeah, so it feels like it's teaching us something. Jupiter also represents teachers
Mm,
about what Uranus has been doing in this place. And it really feels like a bringing it all together, like a fisherman with a net. It's like lifting the fish out of the water and like, look at what I caught.
yeah.
Um, and so I'm thinking about things that have come up since Uranus entered Taurus, like cryptocurrency has been a really big thing that because Taurus often deals with money,
Mm-hmm.
um, and Uranus deals with technology. Like we thought cryptocurrency wasn't really a thing, and then it did kind of explode a few times. I'm sure we'll see a highlight of that. Uh, Revolutions in food,
Mm-hmm.
and in like unfortunately factory chemically made food.
Mm-hmm.
Like some of it's like fake meat, which is cool. Like as a vegetarian, I'm not a hater.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's an interesting one. There's also been this interesting evolution in the way that we orient to our bodies
Mm-hmm.
as a holistic, like holistic wellness, like
Yeah.
spiritual wellness, mental wellness, physical wellness, emotional wellness. They're
Mm-hmm.
all interlocking.
Yeah.
And I think there's been a huge movement since Uranus has entered Taurus that has like not super been talked about, but there's all of these like wellness apps for like
Mm.
tracking your period
Mm-hmm.
or tracking what you're eating or did you meditate today? Like, and maybe you have like a wellness what do they call it when you have like a bunch of apps in like one section of your phone?
Mm-hmm.
So Jupiter is affirming whatever like seemingly rapid changes that have been made on collective and on individual levels in the Taurus part of our charts since Uranus entered Taurus.
Yeah.
I also am thinking about the Mars Uranus North Node conjunction of August 2022.
Mm.
Um, and this is definitely like a more positive version of that, but that might be a time for people to think about uh, just as a like a paying back to of
Mm-hmm.
like what was happening then and what's different now in how I'm seeing it.
Yeah.
Whatever the friction was there. Maybe it's like when you discover that you have some genetic disease, for example, and it sucks to discover that, and there's like inflammation, but then you reorient everything that you were doing to involve taking certain herbs and taking time for yourself every day, and you go through this like huge 180 of how you take care of your body, and suddenly your life is like 1,000 times better. You've met all these
Mm-hmm.
people, you're reading all of these books that are helping you think about the world differently, and you actually feel better than when you didn't know that you had this thing,
Yeah.
or maybe before you had this illness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um
Yeah.
yeah, uh,
I like that. I feel like part of the Uranus and Taurus story has felt very non-linear, or it's kind of felt like very it can have this kind of disjointed quality um, with it being Uranus, and also it's a slightly longer transit. And there have been, as you mentioned, the North Node was on there, and then also throughout 2021, I remember Saturn was squaring that Uranus also quite a bit. So um, it's, I think it's cute that Jupiter's last storyline in Taurus here is can bring some sort of cohesion, to kind of use your word,
mhm.
and maybe to give us a clearer sense of like what was what we've been learning too, because I think there's something about Jupiter that's about like what are the lessons that you've been learning from this particular, on a micro level. What have you learned about your nature? What have you learned about your body? What have you learned about this area that's ruled by Taurus in your life? Hmm.
Yeah, it feels very
Yeah.
positive too. It's interesting the like affirmation of learning. I love the Kepler and Galileo example, the
Mm.
separate public discoveries
Hmm.
that confirmed the Copernican theory of the solar system, because
Hmm.
that conjunction was in Gemini.
Hmm.
So of course it's going to be affirmed twice. Um, so I really I appreciate that in that it feels like it repings like it's like words of affirmation that the thing that
Mm.
you've been doing in this
Mhm.
area of your life,
Mhm.
uh, even through the friction of the Uranus Saturn squares, because like Uranus and Saturn were square when Saturn was in Aquarius, and there was just so much rupture and upset, and it was like we could never get ahead.
Yeah.
And I think what it will also do is Jupiter and Saturn tend to kind of work as a team. They belong
Mhm.
to the same sect.
Mhm.
They're both gas giants. So is Uranus. Um, and whatever stuck around through the Saturn Uranus squares, whatever you were able to uh, somehow like grow roots for, even if it was difficult, even if it was tenuous, like all of that work that you put in will likely be affirmed under
Mm.
the Jupiter Uranus conjunction. Be
Yeah.
like, oh, this is what I was working towards. This is that feeling that I wanted. And I had this goal in mind, and there were so many times that I thought it wasn't going to happen. Um, but now we're here, and I'm really grateful that I like followed my desire
Mm.
for this like approach to this part of my life, because
Hmm.
it's in a Venus ruled sign. There is going to be some aspect of desire there.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. How you feeling? Should we move
Feeling
to
good.
May?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think just the last thing I would say is like the Mercury direct station right after that does feel a little bit important because it's conjunct the North Node.
Oh, right.
So it just like we have this Jupiter Uranus conjunction. This is what I meant by like you're in Barbie land, then you're on the road, then you're in a different land, then you're on the road again, then you're back in Barbie land. It's like we go to the Taurus land, and then we go right back to the eclipse season story.
Mm.
Um,
Hmm.
and this feels like that final sort of ping because it's on the North Node,
Yeah.
like right in the middle of Aries. And this is the decan of Aries that the sun is it's the sun's decan of Aries. And
Hmm.
I think the image for this decan is the crown. And
Mm.
so there's something about this decan of Aries that deals with power or being the best at something. And when the North Node is there, I think there will be a lot of clamoring for who gets to be the best. So there's like questions around like world superpower stuff, but also just, thinking about in your life,
Yeah.
um, where do you where are you trying to wear the crown? And like what does it
Mm.
look like to be the courageous nobleman,
Hmm.
or to have the power? And Mercury's station sort of solidifies the who's holding that, I think,
Hmm.
because Mercury is the herald
Hmm.
that communicates with the other planetary gods, the messenger, and like influences the ways of godly nation states, right? So there's it's like literally negotiating peace accords, but
Hmm.
also power accords.
Right.
So that feels like an important moment to just April 25th acknowledge. And then we finally then we go back to Taurus land and we're like
Hmm.
there for a minute.
Yeah.
Well,
Totally.
Venus enters Taurus and it's like, oh, thank God.
Yeah. um, okay. So May is pretty big too. Um,
Mhm.
before we kind of get more of a break, I feel like in June. So May on the 15th, we have Mercury entering Taurus. So we're really, really in like Taurus land by then. And then the 25th, Jupiter enters Gemini, which is a big one. On the
Mhm.
19th, Mars conjoin the North Node. On the 20th, Sun enters Gemini. And the 23rd, Venus enters Gemini. So
Mhm.
I'd say the big one here is definitely Jupiter entering Gemini, right? Jupiter has been in
Totally.
Taurus for some time and then had that conjunction with Uranus and then finally enters Gemini. Um, mhm. What's coming up for you, Erin, around this? Jupiter in Gemini.
Um,
You and I had some
wow.
conversations about this.
Yeah, so
I've been
many.
contemplating.
I love that like the beginning of May, like the bulk of May is just like wrapping up everything that happened in April. Like we have time to just like like survey the damage, so to speak.
Hmm.
But really like we have time to integrate, which is nice before Jupiter enters Gemini. And then all bets are off again. But yeah, I saw this video of Jupiter's associated with eagles
Hmm.
because, well, if we think about Jupiter being a planet that deals with like perspective and zooming out, like an eagle's eye perspective, as an example, is a very Jupiterian um, way of thinking. And the yeah, I saw this video the other day of these two eagles that were fighting in the sky, and they had their talons like locked in each other, and they were sort of swirling and swirling, and then they had to like break apart in order to land safely. And that's what Jupiter and Gemini feels like a little bit. It's like you can't have the eagle's eye perspective because you are
Mm.
busy fighting with yourself, or you are busy, like there's two different perspectives, two different
Hmm.
eagle's eye perspectives, and they
Hmm.
are locked into each other. And there's a little bit of spiraling or trying to pay attention to everything at once, as opposed to trying to carry the like holistic view. So, um, yeah, I think it's important to mention like Jupiter's in detriment in Gemini. That doesn't
Hmm.
mean that Jupiter can't do what it's supposed to do, but it's not super strong there.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the resources to stabilize and cohere because Gemini is a place of seeing double.
Hmm.
And it's really hard to cohere when you're feeling dizzy.
Yeah. Yeah. I keep thinking about how Gemini to me is, if I'm thinking about a landscape, right? Gemini is mutable air. In the northern hemisphere here, it's like at the end of spring. There's kind of an unpredictable quality to like the Gemini path, right? The Gemini path
Mm-hmm.
is about following one step after another. Oops, I bumped into this thing, and then it actually turned into a flower. And it's kind of like, it's reminding me of Alice in Wonderland a little bit, right? And there's a
Yeah.
quality of like, can you just let yourself be curious, be on this adventure, and not worry too much about what's going to come out of that thing that you did, 5 minutes ago, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
Jupiter is, as you mentioned earlier, has this um, propensity towards like wanting to cohere, wanting to conclude, wanting to make sense of something. And I think in Gemini, it may be, this may be an energy of trying to make sense of that which is inherently unmake sensible, right? Or like doesn't really doesn't really belong as like one piece, but somehow there can be this force of like, but what about if it is one coherent piece? I'm consistently thinking about. I don't know. Right now, I'm thinking about Robert Schumann. I don't know if you know this composer in the
Mm-mm. I
Romantic
mean,
period.
like, I know his name, but
Yeah, sort of. But basically, because I studied classical piano, here's a composer who wrote these like tiny little pieces and then tries to like create a bigger work out of them, right? So like sometimes like there would be this 40-minute piano piece and it's all consisted of like 2-minute little pieces.
Phillips,
That's kind
yeah.
of, yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking about when I think about Jupiter and Gemini. I was also thinking about that TV show Black Mirror, right? Where there
Mm-hmm.
is clearly like an undertone of like, this dystopian future where um, technology can kind of take over in like a dark way, right?
Yeah.
But other than that, there's not really a through line between the different episodes. It's not like trying to
Mm-hmm.
lead to a particular storyline. Hmm.
Yeah. Well, the through line is the mood, which I think references the square to Saturn in Pisces, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
mood of Black Mirror is the through
Mm-hmm.
line, and
Yes.
and the darkness, like the
Yes.
dark mood. Um, and so I really love that analogy. It also is interesting to me that the first thing that Jupiter does when it enters Gemini is it trines Pluto.
Mm-hmm.
And like it happens right, like Jupiter enters Gemini and everything else, I think, has everything else gotten into Gemini yet? No, that happens right after. So Jupiter
Mm-hmm.
enters Gemini, then Mars conjoins the North Node, then the sun enters Gemini, then Venus enters Gemini, and suddenly we have this like huge Gemini stellium. But
Yes.
before that Gemini stellium like sort of manifests itself, we have the Jupiter-Pluto trine. And I loved what you said about like things sort of popping off but not making sense.
Mm.
Because the mythical story of the Gemini twins is, you know, they have these like family feuds with their cousins. And in one of their fights, one of the twins, the mortal twin, is killed. And the other twin, Pollux, Castor and Pollux. So Castor's killed, and Pollux is about to be killed, and Zeus throws down a lightning bolt to protect his son,
Mm.
and kills off the cousins. And then Pollux is left weeping over his brother, and Zeus gives Pollux a choice and says, "You can either spend the rest of eternity on Mount Olympus in your rightful place as an immortal being, or you can share your immortality with your brother, and you're going to spend one day on Mount Olympus and one day in the underworld for the rest of like forever." And he chooses to share his immortality with his brother. He's like, ride or die, I'd rather be with you and like have this like constant um, sort of shift from heavens to underworld, like wild, sort of almost like bipolar experience,
Mm-hmm.
than do it alone. Like I want to share this with you. That's the most
Mm.
important thing to me. You're the most
Mm-hmm.
important thing in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't necessarily make sense, that choice, but it also does. Like it
Mm.
makes sense why he would choose his brother.
Mm-hmm.
And the trine to Pluto, which is king of the underworld, I think is going to, again, Jupiter coheres and affirms and stabilizes and grows, even if it's in Gemini.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's going to show us really quickly some of the things that don't make sense, or seemingly don't make sense, but are going to explode positively anyway. So the other thing to remember is that Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions usually are the most potent, but those are often indicators of like enormous wealth,
Mm.
whether it's explosions in wealth or incredible loss of wealth or transference of wealth. A trine is a harmonious aspect. So
Mm-hmm.
things that Pluto emphasizes that we've already talked about, like AI being a big part of this, you know, fears of like mass. Yeah, I'm trying to think of like other good examples of Pluto and Aquarius. Um, just like mass like overhaul of systems, like maybe healthcare. I don't know. There are certain things that we maybe think are like out of this world or insane or crazy. And Jupiter's like, well, here's why.
Mm-hmm.
Here's why we're going to do this. And like,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to work anyway, whether or not you want it to.
Yeah.
And that's something to look out for of like, uh, it it's the question of like, whether is it really moral or is it a shady deal or is it both?
Mm. Mm. Yeah, it's also giving me conspiracy theory vibes as well. This one,
Totally.
like there may be some really out there or seemingly out there conspiracy theories that are proven to be true or something like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
with this
I'm
Jupiter and Gemini.
definitely
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely interested in like Google just recently during the Mercury retrograde in Sag, um, Capricorn Sag just released Gemini Pro, which is its like version of OpenAI ChatGPT. Um, and I feel like we're gonna see more of that at this moment.
Mm-hmm. It's a little too on the nose,
Yeah.
even with the name.
Yeah,
Um,
especially with the Mars Rahu conjunction right after that, which like
mm-hmm.
um, is
Mm-hmm.
more of what we talked about with Mercury station direct, more of the North Node stuff. It's like Mars
Yeah,
finally meets up with the North Node. That's a there's no way around it. That's a violent moment.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, Okay, so let's quickly talk about the quiet
June.
June. And we'll pick it back up in part two. So in June, there's really only a couple signatures in the beginning, which is on the third we have Mercury entering Gemini, its place of domicile. The fourth we have a Venus Cazimi in Gemini, and then the eighth Mars enters Taurus. Um, my sense here is that this is more of a continuation of the Jupiter and Gemini story. I feel like, this is not to say that there's not going to be, that June is not going to be interesting, because I think it's maybe just more of a continuation of what Jupiter entering Gemini will bring. Because I don't know if you sense this too, Erin, but I'm sensing that like Jupiter entering Gemini may not be super subtle. I think, especially um, Jupiter being kind of a loud, big influence. But that being said, with all these other planets also entering Gemini, and especially Mercury, I'm really looking at Mercury entering Gemini here as kind of bringing another dimension, another overtone of like what it was introducing, and maybe more the plot thickens in June. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. This is like, um, to me, this is the moment when uh I think, I don't know, this is the moment when we're down to like final four survivor. Final five, final four. Like things are starting to, we think they're starting to cohere.
Mm.
That doesn't mean that we know who's gonna win,
Mm-hmm.
but like you're down to a point where you know who the few couples left are, like the few alliances, who's gonna work with who. Um, it's definitely a thickening plot. That doesn't mean that there can't still be red herrings, so to speak.
Mm.
But I definitely feel that. I also think the Venus Cassimi is important because it marks a big turning point in Venus's cycle where
Mm.
she goes from being a evening star to a, is that right? Evening star to a morning star? Before that, hang on, let me just look back really quick. Um, yeah, she goes from being a evening star to a morning star.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because up until this point, we've had like the whole first half of 2024 is again those stelliums. And part of that is that we had the outer planets in the first half of the zodiac, right? We've had Pluto in Capricorn Aquarius, then we've had Saturn in Pisces, then we've had the North Node in Aries, then we've had Jupiter in Taurus, and now in Gemini. And now the personal planets are kind of on their own.
Mm.
And so the Venus Cazimi feels like that point where we start to see that um, night sect team. So Venus, Moon, Mars, they all, and Mercury, which is neutral, can belong to either sect depending on solar phase and all kinds of other things. Um, yeah, they move on. They move on to the next round.
Mm-hmm.
They get to
Mm-hmm.
stick around, and everyone else is left behind on the judges panel to vote who wins. So there's a yeah, there's a definite change in tone
Mm-hmm.
um for the planets that are closer to the sun,
Mm-hmm.
and Venus is a planet of attraction and desire. And so when Venus is in the heart of the sun, there is usually like a, a clarity moment. Like it comes back to what we were talking about, like that Dionysian feel of the Sun Pluto conjunction. Like anytime we have a planet conjunct the sun, there is that you release all of the toxins and you're only left with what it is. Like you
Mm.
heat it up so much and you sweat out all the toxins and you're left with the clarity. like if you're working with plant medicine or something. And a Venus cazimi is just like all of those, but there's an interesting thing about it being in Gemini.
Mm-hmm.
Is like, well, you're not left with only one thing, you're left with two things because it's Gemini. And
Mm-hmm.
so what are the two things that you're carrying forth or tending? And it might be a moment, I sort of see it as like the thread that we've been carrying through 2024 splits. It's like a split hair or split thread, and you still carry them
Mm-hmm.
both with you,
Mm-hmm.
but they're yeah, there's a there's it's not, again, Venus isn't commitment. She's just desire.
Yeah, yeah. I really like this imagery of kind of the split path because Venus in Gemini is always curious to me. I mean, and
Mhm.
you and I talk about how, transits are not people, but I've known quite a few Venus and Gemini people in my life, and um I do think that this is a moment about like really clarifying one's desire for fascination and
Mm.
curiosity and um yeah, the ways in which we can be fulfilled by exploring those curiosities and not really
Totally.
worrying too much about like, is this going to lead to something um that's durable necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing is Venus and Gemini is like peak influencer energy, right?
Yeah.
Because it's in Mercury's sign, it's peregrine, whereas
Hmm.
Venus in Virgo is fallen. Venus in Gemini, like has Mercury's skill set of
Mm.
message carrying, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Has voice, has access to words, has access to community support and like channels and can like kind of pop off.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know how focused the message usually is for Venus and Gemini. Um, and so oftentimes it can be like quippy and like not super competent, not super intentional.
Yeah.
But I think the Kazemi with the sun brings intentionality to it. It
Mm.
brings cohesion to it because
Hmm.
the sun is the center of the solar system. The sun, like Jupiter, has a cohering effect.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel as good maybe as um like it feels good in a different way than Jupiter does. Jupiter feels good like cushy pillows, right?
Hmm.
Um, but the sun feels good like I just sat in a sweat lodge for a while
Hmm.
and I feel great coming out. Like the air is cool and refreshing, and I'm drinking water and I'm looking at this beautiful view.
Hmm.
Um, it's like it's a totally different experience. And I don't know, do we talk about the Jupiter Sun conjunction? Has that happened yet? Maybe that's July.
I'm looking
Um,
at it. Where is it? Interesting.
transiting Sun conjunct. Oh, it's in May. So that
We did
actually
not talk
happens in
about it.
Taurus.
Hmm.
That happens in Taurus, right at the same time as the Venus-Uranus conjunction.
Right.
Um, Maybe we ping back to that really quick
Sure.
and then finish, call it.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Um,
Hmm.
yeah. Wow, Venus, Uranus, and Jupiter and the Sun all at the same time. That's an interesting one in Taurus. That feels like a
Hmm.
yeah, it's
That
interesting. I
feels
feel
like the
like
four survivors to me.
yeah, actually, yeah, 100%. And like when they finish, it's interesting too because like there's been a case made for Uranus not being named Uranus but being named Prometheus. And
Hmm.
when they're down to four, one person who like wins a challenge gets to choose another person who definitely goes to final three, and the other two have to battle it out with a fire making challenge.
Mm. Hmm.
And that is like Venus, Uranus are fire making, and Uranus is gonna win. But
Hmm.
maybe not because like it's Venus's sign, so it's
It's
like a kind of
Venus's.
neck and neck.
Right.
Yeah. Um, but I think I really see the Venus-Uranus conjunction as backing up Jupiter. Whatever the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction was, Venus comes through and is like, it's like another, Jupiter gave the affirmation, like the words of affirmation, and Venus grew the roots.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's like Uranus has been pulling up roots in Taurus this entire time, and Venus is like, okay, time to grow some roots. And it's interesting because if you look at lightning in the sky,
Mm.
it looks like the roots of a tree, like actual lightning. And so
Mm-hmm.
it kind of has that
Totally.
feeling a little
Mm-hmm.
bit of
Mm-hmm.
like um, the thing that is lighting you up or that you didn't maybe think was going to come through or that you've been working for or working against. And suddenly you're like, no, I actually do really want this.
Mm-hmm.
And everything is ushering me along to make it happen. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. And then the sun with Jupiter to me feels very much like um that's like the sun affirming Jupiter. Like Jupiter went and affirmed Uranus. It's like the way that gurus have a guru.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
gurus have teachers too.
Yeah.
And very often the teacher is within or is the god or is the
Mm-hmm.
land or like is something bigger than. It has sort of like bigger than
Yeah.
energy.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. Mm-hmm. I'm also thinking about that moment of exact conjunction between Jupiter and the Sun. The moon's
Mm.
actually in Libra, which is really cute, ruled by
It is cute.
Venus in Taurus. So it
Yeah.
just all seems kind of like it's not just experience in the embodied, but also in the relational field. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting. I'm just going to make a plug for Amaya Rourke
Mm.
real quick because
Mm-hmm.
the Jupiter Sun conjunction is like it's like on Algol. It's like within a degree.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And she's been doing some like incredible work on the fixed star Algol and also Medusa, both in witchcraft and in astrology, and has like
Mm-hmm.
refined and reaffirmed and enhanced these workshops over the course of years and like tons of research. And that might be something that could be really helpful to visit around Taurus season.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Love Amaya's work. Well, any final words, Erin, before we close out? I feel like
Oh,
this is an epic adventure that we are kind of embarking on, actually.
yeah.
I'm
I
enjoying
feel
this.
like I have less words, more breath, like deep breath. Yeah, it's interesting to like walk through the first half of the year and just
Hmm.
like it's so different than the second half of the year.
It is. It is.
Um, the first half of the year definitely it feels like it's like we enter limbo in the first half of the year, and then the second half of the year is like we hang out in limbo.
Like, what do we do with limbo once we
Yeah,
get there?
yeah.
Hmm.
We're
Hmm.
now relating to limbo.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's kind of how I'm feeling. I'm excited to talk about the rest of it.
Hmm. Me too. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughtfulness. And I just have the best time with you always. In
Oh,
case
thanks, Jonathan.
people, you're welcome. In case people want to find you, how can they find you? And if you have, yeah, what do you have going on?
Sure. I am at ET Shipley on all of the socials. So
Hmm.
Instagram, Threads. I'm not on X, formerly known as Twitter. It's too much of a mouthful anymore. I'm like on it, but like, invisible basically.
Mm,
Uh, and you can also find me at etshipley.com where you can sign up for my newsletter. I send out a newsletter generally about monthly in order to book a consult. I'm probably going to be running another cohort of my course Templum Adis.
mm,
I'm thinking in March, but
amazing.
we'll see. And cooking up a couple of strategizing your year ahead sessions. But those are in the works. So sign up for my newsletter and you'll hear about them and how to book one of those if that's something that feels exciting to you. And I hope you tune in to the other half, which
Yeah.
hopefully will be released shortly after this one.
I'm excited for the second half as well. And just a word of recommendation. Erin's newsletter is just amazing. Like, I love how much love and care and just like it always opens my mind every time I read your newsletter. So thank you for putting in the care, and yeah, you're just such a beautiful writer. So really appreciate it.
Jonathan, that means so much coming from you.
All right. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jonathan.